Tonight we're slipping into a place colder than a steel table, brighter than a fluorescent ceiling, and filled with more quiet screaming than any history book will ever tell you. A place where women were strapped down, smiled at, and shocked into silence by men who genuinely believed they were helping. Welcome to the psychiatric ward of 1960s America. Now dim those lights, fluff that pillow, and burrow into your blankets like you're hiding from a house call. What did they actually do to these women? What was an ice pick doing in a hospital? Who was the man driving a van full of lobotomy tools across America like he was selling encyclopedias? What did the wards smell like? What did the wives wear when their husbands signed the papers? Was there ever a moment, just one, when somebody in a white coat looked at a sobbing woman and thought, maybe she's not sick, maybe she's just exhausted? And what happened to the ones who walked back out, quieter, slower, smiling at nothing? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1962 in a long white corridor that smells like ammonia and overcooked vegetables. You're wearing a pale blue gown that ties in the back, the kind that never quite ties properly. Your hair is still set from yesterday. Somewhere down the hall a radio is playing Patti Page very softly, the way nurses prefer their music, quiet enough to pretend it isn't there. You don't entirely remember how you got here. You remember crying at the kitchen table. You remember your husband on the phone in the next room, his voice low and careful, the way men speak when they are arranging something for your own good. You remember a doctor's hand on your shoulder, warm and dry, and a sentence that began with, "We think it would be best." You remember signing something, or maybe he signed it. The pen was heavy, the paper was thin, the light in the office was the colour of weak tea. Now you're here. Take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy drifting off to deeply unsettling, deeply factual history that your high school teacher absolutely skipped over. And if you're already comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what you were told growing up about women who cried too much. The corridor is very long. The floor is the colour of a dirty pearl, polished to a shine that catches the overhead lights and throws them back at the ceiling. The walls are painted that particular shade of green that mid-century institutions loved, a green that was supposed to be calming, chosen by a committee of men in 1948, a green that has since calmed no one. There are doors on either side, heavy doors with small reinforced windows, and behind some of those windows there are faces, not pressed against the glass, just nearby, watching the corridor the way people in waiting rooms watch a clock. The air smells like floor wax, like boiled cabbage, like the faint sweet rot of flowers left too long in a vase, like cigarette smoke ground into upholstery, and underneath all of that, very faintly, like fear. Fear has a smell in places like this. It is not dramatic. It is the smell of bodies that have been sitting too still for too long. A nurse passes you. Her uniform is starched so stiffly that it creaks when she walks. Her cap is pinned at exactly the angle the manual recommends. She does not look at you. She's carrying a small metal tray, and on the tray there is a paper cup containing 2 pills and a glass of water and a clipboard. She's on her way somewhere specific. In this building, everyone is always on their way somewhere specific. You realise slowly that you are cold. Not freezing, just cold in the way that hospital corridors are always cold, a cold that lives in the floor and rises through your slippered feet and settles somewhere behind your knees. The radiators in this building were installed in 1934 and have not been adjusted since. They clank twice an hour, mournfully, and accomplish very little. Somewhere far away a door closes. Somewhere closer a woman laughs once sharply and then stops. You become aware gradually of your own breathing. If you enjoy listening to sleepy historical stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly, and tonight's is going to be a long, slow walk through one of the strangest and saddest corners of American medicine, a place where good intentions and bad science held hands and walked women off a cliff. So settle in, we're going to take our time. Let's talk about the building. The state hospital you have woken up in was built in 1903. It was designed by a man named Henry, who had also designed 2 prisons and a train station, and who believed, with the unshakable confidence of Edwardian architects, that mental illness could be cured by ventilation. He gave the building tall windows, long wings radiating from a central administrative hub like the spokes of a wheel, wide lawns, and a small ornamental fountain that has not worked since the Truman administration. The bricks are the colour of dried blood. The roof is slate. From the air, if you happen to be a pigeon, the whole complex would look like a very serious flower. Inside, the building has aged the way institutional buildings age, not gracefully, but stubbornly. The original wooden floors have been covered with linoleum. The original gas lamps have been wired for electricity, then rewired in the 40s, then rewired again in the 50s when somebody noticed that the wiring from the 40s was a fire hazard. The original plaster walls have been painted, repainted, and painted again, layer over layer, until in some rooms you can press a thumbnail into the wall and feel half a century of decisions give slightly under your hand. There are wards for men, there are wards for women, there are wards for the elderly, there are wards for what the staff still occasionally call, in 1962, the violent cases, though in the new spirit of professionalism that phrase is being slowly replaced by the gentler, the agitated. There is a wing for children, which everyone tries not to think about. There is a chapel that holds services on Sundays, attended mostly by nurses. There is a small library with 2 shelves of donated books, mostly Reader's Digest condensed novels and one extremely well-thumbed copy of Rebecca. There is a kitchen the size of a barn, where industrial pots the size of bathtubs simmer, with something that has been described charitably as soup. There is also, somewhere on the lower floors, the treatment room. We will get to the treatment room. For now, picture the women's ward. It is on the 2nd floor of the East Wing. There are 40 beds in a long open dormitory, lined up against the walls with the precision of soldiers at inspection. Each bed has a thin mattress, a white sheet, a grey wool blanket, and a single pillow that has been turned and returned by so many heads that it has developed a permanent dip in the middle. Between each bed there is a small metal nightstand. On each nightstand there is room for exactly 3 things: a glass of water, a book, and a small framed photograph. Many of the nightstands hold only the water. The windows are tall and narrow and reinforced with wire mesh embedded in the glass. The mesh casts a faint grid of shadows across the floor in the afternoons, a pattern that the women have learned to ignore the way you learn to ignore wallpaper. Beyond the windows you can see lawn, and beyond the lawn the brick wall that surrounds the property, and beyond the wall, occasionally, a passing car, a bird, the top of a distant tree. The world is still out there. It is simply on the other side of the wire. The dormitory smells like talcum powder, sweat, bleach, and the particular sweetness of cheap shampoo. There is always, somewhere in the background, the sound of someone weeping quietly, and the sound of someone humming a song from before the war, and the sound of a nurse turning the pages of a chart at the desk by the door. None of these sounds is loud, none of them ever stops. Above each bed, a small white card has been clipped to the metal frame. On each card is written a name, a date of admission, and a diagnosis. The diagnoses are interesting. Hysteria, neurasthenia, involutional melancholia, anxiety neurosis, schizoid features, inadequate personality, housewife syndrome, a phrase you will not find in the official manuals but which appears more than once in margins, in shorthand, in the casual conversation of doctors who do not realize their patients can hear them. We're going to spend a lot of time tonight thinking about those diagnoses, because almost none of them mean what they sound like they mean, and almost all of them were, in the hands of the wrong man with the wrong tools, a doorway into the treatment room. But before we go through that door, let's go further back. Let's go all the way back gently to how a woman in 1962 ended up in a bed like this in the first place. Because the road that led her here did not begin with a doctor. It began, almost always, with a kitchen. Picture the kitchen. It is small and very clean and yellow. The walls are yellow because in 1957, when she and her husband moved into the house, a magazine told her that yellow was the colour of cheerfulness, and she wanted very much to be cheerful, and she painted the walls herself one weekend in April while he was at a baseball game. The cabinets are white with chrome handles. The floor is linoleum, patterned with little gold starbursts that have faded in the high traffic spots in front of the sink and the stove. The curtains are gingham. The clock on the wall is shaped like a teapot. The teapot has a face. The face is smiling. It is 6 a.m. She is already up. She has been up since 5:40, which is when she gets up every weekday, in order to have breakfast on the table by 6:30, which is when her husband comes downstairs, which is when he expects breakfast. Breakfast is eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, and orange juice. The juice is from a can of concentrate she mixed last night in the refrigerator. The bacon is frying. The eggs will go in next, 2 of them, sunny side up, the way he likes them, with the yolks slightly runny but not too runny, which is a margin of approximately 15 seconds. She's wearing a cotton house dress, blue with small white flowers, and a clean white apron tied at the waist. Her hair is set. She set it last night after he went to bed, sitting in front of the bathroom mirror with a row of pink curlers and a small tube of setting lotion that smelled like lilac and chemistry. Her makeup is on, light but present. A little powder, a little blush, a little of the coral lipstick he once said he liked in 1955, in a tone that she has remembered ever since. She is smiling. She is smiling because the magazines say to smile, because the radio program says to smile, because her mother said to smile, because if she does not smile, somewhere underneath the smiling, she might begin to cry, and there is no time for that. There is breakfast. This is the world she lives in, and it has rules. The rules are not written down exactly. They live in the air like dust. They live in the advertisements in Ladies' Home Journal, where a woman in pearls vacuums a carpet with an expression of religious ecstasy. They live in the marriage manuals her mother gave her on her wedding day, which explained in tasteful italics that a wife's first duty is to create a peaceful home for her husband to return to. They live in the sermons at the church she attends every Sunday, where the minister, who is a kind man, gently reminds the congregation that the wife is the heart of the home, the keeper of its warmth, the soft hand at the centre of the family's life. They live in her husband's mother, who calls every Wednesday and asks in a voice that is somehow both casual and surgical whether she has been keeping up with the ironing. The rules say a great many things. The rules say her house must be clean. Not clean in the practical sense, the dishes done, floor swept sense, but clean in the deeper sense, the kind of clean that suggests a woman of moral seriousness. The bathroom tiles must shine, the windows must not show streaks, the refrigerator must be wiped down weekly, including the rubber gasket around the door, the oven must be scrubbed, the silverware must be polished, the kitchen floor must be waxed. There is a product for each of these tasks, and the products are advertised on television by women who look exactly like her, except younger and happier and never tired. The rules say her children must be well behaved. She has 2, a boy of 7, a girl of 4. The boy is in 2nd grade. The girl is in nursery school 3 mornings a week, which is the closest thing to time off she has, and which she usually spends doing the laundry. The children must be clean, neatly dressed, polite to adults, and academically average or better. If they misbehave in public, it reflects on her. If they misbehave in private, it reflects on her. If they are sick, it reflects on her. If they fail a spelling test, it reflects on her. The praise, when it comes, goes to her husband because he is the provider. The blame, when it comes to her because she is the home. The rules say her body must be presentable. She's 32 years old. She has had 2 children. The magazines suggest, gently and constantly, that she should look as though she has had neither. She should weigh what she weighed at 20. Her skin should be smooth. Her hair should be styled. Her clothes should be appropriate to the occasion, of which there are many. The supermarket occasion, the church occasion, the dinner party occasion, the school pickup occasion, the unexpected visitor occasion. She has separate shoes for several of these. The rules say she must not complain. This is the rule that matters tonight. She may discuss the weather. She may discuss the neighbours, in moderation, and only in a tone of mild, affectionate amusement. She may discuss recipes, sales at the department store, her children's small accomplishments, her husband's small accomplishments, the minister's sermon, the weather again. She may not discuss the long, grey emptiness she feels at 3 p.m. when the children are still at school, and the house is silent, and she stands in the kitchen holding a sponge and cannot remember what she was going to clean. She may not discuss the way she sometimes sits in the bathroom for 10 minutes longer than necessary, because the bathroom is the only room in the house where no one expects her to be doing something. She may not discuss the night 2 weeks ago when she stood at the kitchen sink at 1 a.m. and washed the same plate 7 times because she could not remember whether she had washed it. She may not discuss the fact that when her husband touches her shoulder, gently in passing, she sometimes wants to scream, not because she does not love him. She does, in the steady, tired way of long marriages, but because she has not been alone, truly alone, with her own thoughts since approximately 1953. These thoughts have a name in 1962, although she does not yet know the name. In a few years, a writer named Betty will give the name to it, and the name will become famous, and women all over the country will read the book and weep with recognition. But that is in the future. For now, in this yellow kitchen on this Tuesday morning in November, the feeling has no name. It is simply the way the day feels. It is the weight in her chest when she wakes up. It is the strange flat quality of the light in the afternoon. It is the way she sometimes finds herself standing in the middle of a room, holding a dishcloth, with no memory of having come in. She turns the bacon. The bacon hisses. Upstairs, the floorboards creak. Her husband, walking from the bedroom to the bathroom. She has perhaps 4 minutes before he comes downstairs. She uses them to crack the eggs. The kitchen is yellow, the clock is smiling, everything is fine. This is how it begins, almost every time. Not with a breakdown, not with a scream, just with a yellow kitchen and a smiling clock, and a long, quiet feeling that has no name. Now let's talk about the doctor. In 1962, in a small medical office on a tree-lined street in any American town you can picture, there is a general practitioner named, let's say, Dr. Hendricks. He is 54 years old. He has a wife and 3 grown children. He went to medical school in 1932. He served in the army during the war, where he treated mostly infections and a few gunshot wounds. He came home, opened a practice, and has been treating the same families for 30 years. He knows their birthdays, he delivered some of their babies. He is, by every reasonable measure, a good man. His office is small and a little cluttered. There is a wooden desk, an examination table covered in white paper that crinkles when you sit on it, a glass-fronted cabinet full of supplies, a window that looks out onto a parking lot, and on the wall 3 framed certificates and a calendar from a pharmaceutical company. The calendar this month shows a sunset over a mountain lake. The pharmaceutical company makes, among other things, a small white pill called Milltown. Dr. Hendricks is a believer in modern medicine. This is important. He came of age professionally during a period of astonishing medical progress. He has seen, with his own eyes, antibiotics save lives that would have been lost 20 years earlier. He has seen polio go from a terror of every summer to a vaccine in a sugar cube. He has seen surgery become safer, anesthesia become reliable, diagnostic tools become precise. He has every reason, by 1962, to believe that medicine is on a steady upward march, that what cannot be cured today will be cured tomorrow, that the white-coated profession he belongs to is, on the whole, making the world better. He's not wrong about most of this. He is, however, about to be very wrong about one specific thing. Because in 1962, the same pharmaceutical revolution that gave him antibiotics has also given him something else. It has given him a category of drugs called minor tranquilizers, meprobamate sold as Milltown and Equinil, and a newer compound called chlordiazepoxide sold as Librium, with another, diazepam, sold as Valium, just about to arrive on the market in a way that will rewrite American domestic life. These drugs are marketed to him, intensively, by pharmaceutical sales representatives who visit his office every few months with samples and brochures and lunches at the country club. The brochures show, almost without exception, women. The brochures show a woman with her head in her hands at a kitchen table. They show a woman staring out a window with an expression of vague distress. They show a woman surrounded by laundry, or by children, or by both. The copy explains that this woman is suffering from anxiety, or tension, or the particular stresses of modern domestic life, and that a small daily dose of the advertised compound will restore her, gently and without addiction, to her natural state of cheerful equilibrium. Dr. Hendricks reads the brochures. He attends the lunches. He listens politely to the sales representatives, who are mostly young men in good suits with firm handshakes and a working knowledge of his golf handicap. He does not exactly believe everything they say. He is not naive. But he does believe, because the medical journals tell him so, because his colleagues tell him so, because the entire culture tells him so, that there is such a thing as the troubled housewife, that she exists in large numbers, that her trouble is a medical condition, and that the medical condition has a treatment. He has been prescribing Milltown since 1955. He prescribes it to about a third of his female patients between the ages of 25 and 55. He does not prescribe it to many of his male patients, although he is not entirely sure why. When a woman comes into his office and says, in the careful indirect way women say these things, that she's been feeling tired, or low, or not herself, he listens. He listens kindly. He asks about her sleep, her appetite, her children, her husband. He does not generally ask about the rest of it, about the hours in the kitchen, about the rules in the air, about whether she's had a single uninterrupted thought of her own since 1953. He does not ask these questions because nobody has taught him to ask these questions, and because if he did ask them, he would not know what to do with the answers. So instead he writes a prescription. The prescription is for Milltown, or sometimes Librium, in a low daily dose with refills. He hands her the slip of paper. He pats her hand. He tells her that this should help her feel more like herself again. He tells her to come back in 6 weeks. She thanks him. She leaves. The next patient comes in. This is the first door. Most women taking the pill will feel a little calmer. They will sleep more easily. The long grey weight will lift slightly, or at least become bearable. They will continue to be wives and mothers and keepers of yellow kitchens, and they will do it on a low daily dose of a sedative, and many of them will do this for years, and many of them will be, on the whole, all right. But some of them will not be all right. Some of them will come back to Dr. Hendricks after 6 weeks, or 3 months, or a year, and say that the pills are not working anymore, or that they have stopped sleeping again, or that they have started crying at odd hours, in supermarkets, on the telephone, in the car, or that they have begun to feel very faintly that they are no longer entirely sure whose life they are living. When this happens, Dr. Hendricks has a choice. He can increase the dose. He can switch the medication. He can refer her to a specialist. If he refers her to a specialist, the specialist is a psychiatrist. And in 1962, the psychiatrist has tools that Dr. Hendricks does not have. This is the second door. We are going to walk through it slowly. Let's talk about the long history of what was done to women's minds, because the 1960s did not invent any of it. The 1960s inherited it. In the ancient world, the womb was believed to be a small wandering animal. The Greek physicians called it hystera, which is where we get the word hysteria, and they believed quite literally that this organ could detach itself from its proper place and roam the body, pressing on other organs, causing fainting, weeping, breathlessness, irritability, and any of 100 other symptoms that men did not otherwise know how to explain. The treatment, depending on which Greek you asked, was marriage, pregnancy, or various herbal fumigations applied in various directions to lure the wandering womb back into position. It is easy to laugh at this. It is also worth remembering, before we laugh, that variations of this idea persisted in respectable Western medicine for about 2,500 years. The medieval period inherited the womb theory and added to it the idea that women's complaints were, in many cases, evidence of moral or spiritual weakness. A weeping woman might be possessed. A withdrawn woman might be a witch. A woman who would not stop talking might be afflicted by a demon of garrulousness, a real and named entity in some demonological texts. The treatments range from prayer to exorcism to, in the worst cases, execution. The bar for what counted as suspicious female behaviour was extraordinarily low. To laugh too loudly, to dance in the wrong way, to live alone past a certain age, to know too much about herbs, to know too little about scripture. Any of these could, in the wrong village in the wrong decade, be enough. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the explicitly religious framework had loosened, and a new framework had taken its place. The new framework was nervous. Quite literally, it was about nerves. Doctors of the period believed that women had finer, more delicate nervous systems than men, which made them more sensitive to emotion, more prone to swooning, more easily overwhelmed by the stresses of life. This sounds almost flattering, until you notice what it justified. It justified the idea that women were unsuited to higher education, because their nerves could not handle the strain. It justified the idea that women were unsuited to public life, voting, professional work, scientific inquiry, and most forms of independence. It justified, in practice, the steady narrowing of women's permitted lives, all in the name of protecting their fragile nervous constitutions from harm. In the 19th century, hysteria came roaring back as a fashionable diagnosis. Doctors in Paris and Vienna and London built their reputations on it. Charcot displayed hysterical women in lectures at the Salpêtrière Hospital, where his theatrical demonstrations of hypnosis and induced symptoms became the medical entertainment of the age. Freud, who attended some of these lectures as a young man, would later build an entire psychological theory partly on his attempts to understand what was happening to these women, although his interpretations would in turn produce their own long catalogue of harms. The Victorian treatments for hysteria were varied and often quite strange. Rest cures, in which a woman was put to bed in a darkened room for weeks or months, fed milk and beef tea, and forbidden to read, write, or exert herself in any way. Water cures, in which she was hosed down with cold water at specified pressures. Electrical treatments, using primitive devices that produced uncomfortable but not dangerous shocks. Pelvic massages, which we will not linger on, although the history is well documented and is, if you read about it, both grim and faintly comedic. Removal of the ovaries, which was performed on thousands of women in the late 19th century in the belief that it would cure mental disturbance. Removal of the clitoris, which was performed, less often but still distressingly often for similar reasons. The early 20th century inherited all of this and added new tools. Freudian psychoanalysis, which at least had the virtue of listening to women, although the listening came packaged with theories that often blamed them for their own suffering. Insulin coma therapy, in which patients were injected with enough insulin to drop them into a coma, on the theory that this somehow reset the brain. Metrazole shock therapy, in which patients were injected with a chemical that induced violent seizures, which patients found so terrifying that many of them remembered the period before each treatment as one of the worst experiences of their lives. Fever therapy, in which patients were deliberately infected with malaria on the theory that the fever would cure their psychiatric symptoms. And then, in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, came the two big ones, the two that brought us, by 1962, to the corridor you're standing in tonight. Electroconvulsive therapy and the lobotomy. These are the doors at the end of the hallway. Let us walk towards them slowly. Picture the year 1938, in a small clinic in Rome. A man named Ugo Cialetti is standing in a basement room looking at a pig. The pig is alive. The pig is also wearing a small metal device on its head, which has just delivered an electrical current through its brain. The pig has had a brief seizure. The pig has recovered. The pig is now standing up again, looking at Cialetti with the placid, bewildered expression of pigs everywhere. Cialetti is an Italian neurologist. He has been working for several years on the problem of how to induce a therapeutic seizure in a human patient. The reason he wants to induce a therapeutic seizure is that, in the 1930s, a Hungarian doctor named Ladislas Meduna had noticed that patients with severe psychiatric symptoms sometimes seemed to improve after having a spontaneous seizure, and had begun deliberately inducing seizures using chemical injections. The chemical method, metrazole, was effective for some patients, but it was also brutal. The seizures it induced were preceded by a period of about 10 to 15 seconds of conscious terror, in which the patient knew exactly what was about to happen, but could not stop it. Many patients begged not to receive it. Some hid. Some tried to escape. The medical consensus was that a less terrifying method of inducing seizures was urgently needed. Cialetti's idea was electricity. Electricity applied to the head in a sufficient dose would cause a seizure instantly, without the long, horrible build-up of the chemical method. The patient would simply, in his words, go to sleep. The seizure would happen. The patient would wake up. The therapeutic effect, whatever it was, would presumably follow. The trouble was that nobody knew, in 1938, exactly how much electricity to use. Too little, and you got nothing. Too much, and you killed your patient. Cialetti and his colleague Lucio Bini had been experimenting on pigs, partly because pigs were available at the local slaughterhouse, and partly because pig anatomy was thought to be sufficiently similar to human anatomy to make the experiments meaningful. The slaughterhouse used a small electrical device to stun the pigs before killing them. Cialetti and Bini studied the device. They worked out what dose stunned a pig without killing it. They built a similar device for humans. In April of 1938, they used it for the first time on a man. The man was about 40 years old. He had been picked up by the Rome police, wandering the streets in a confused state, unable to give his name or address. He had been brought to Cialetti's clinic. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He spoke, when he spoke at all, in fragments of what sounded like neologisms, words he had made up. He had no family that anyone could find. He had not consented to any treatment because he was not, in the legal or medical view of the time, capable of consenting to anything. Cialetti and Binney placed the electrodes on his temples. They turned on the device. They administered a low dose. The man jerked slightly. Nothing else happened. Cialetti was about to administer a higher dose when, according to the famous account, the patient sat up and said, very clearly in plain Italian, "Not another. It will kill me." This is the moment that people remember. This is the moment that gets quoted. Cialetti hesitated. His colleagues urged him on. He administered the higher dose. The man had a full seizure, recovered, and was, according to Cialetti, somewhat improved. What happened to that patient afterwards is not entirely clear. Some accounts say he was discharged. Some say he died within the year. Some say he was simply lost in the Italian medical system. What is clear is that the first electroconvulsive treatment in human history was administered to a man who had explicitly, in a moment of complete lucidity, asked for it not to happen, and who was overruled because he was understood to be incompetent to make that decision. This is worth holding on to. The entire history of the electroconvulsive therapy begins with a patient saying no, and a doctor proceeding anyway. From Rome, the technique spread rapidly. It spread because it worked, in a sense. Many patients, especially patients with severe depression, did seem to improve after a course of treatments. The improvement was sometimes dramatic. Patients who had been catatonic for months were suddenly eating again, speaking, recognizing relatives. Patients who had been suicidal were suddenly able to function. The mechanism was not understood, and would not be understood for decades, but the effect was visible enough that within 5 years the technique was being used in hospitals across Europe and the United States. It was also being used, almost from the beginning, on women in numbers that significantly exceeded its use on men. The records on this are clear. In American state hospitals through the 1940s and 1950s, women received electroconvulsive therapy at rates somewhere between 2 and 3 times that of men. The numbers vary by hospital and by year, but the pattern is consistent. Women got more. Women got it earlier in their hospitalizations. Women got it for a wider range of diagnoses. Women got it sometimes for diagnoses that today would not be considered psychiatric at all. For what would now be called postpartum mood changes. For grief, for what doctors of the period referred to vaguely as agitation or emotional instability. And in the early years, before about 1952, women got it without anesthesia. This is the part of the story that is most difficult to think about, so let's approach it gently. A treatment session in those early years went like this. The patient was brought into a treatment room. She was helped onto a padded table. The room was typically not large. The lighting was bright. The walls were the same calming green as the corridor outside. There were usually 3 or 4 staff present, a doctor, a nurse, and 1 or 2 orderlies. Sometimes a medical student was observing. The patient was asked to lie down. She was asked to remove any hairpins or metal jewellery. A small pad soaked in saline solution was placed on each of her temples. The electrodes were attached to the pads. A rubber bite block was placed in her mouth to prevent her from biting her tongue during the seizure. The staff positioned themselves at her shoulders, her hips and her ankles to hold her down during the convulsion. And then the current was turned on. The seizure that followed was a full tonic-clonic convulsion. The body stiffened, the back arched, the limbs jerked, the face contorted. The seizure lasted between 30 seconds and a minute depending on the dose and the patient. The staff held her down to prevent her from injuring herself. Sometimes, despite their efforts, bones broke. Compression fractures of the spine were the most common injury, occurring in a significant percentage of unmodified treatments. Dislocations of the jaw and shoulders also occurred. Teeth were sometimes broken despite the bite block. After the seizure, the patient was unconscious for several minutes. When she woke, she was disoriented. She did not generally know where she was or what had happened, or who the people around her were. She often did not know her own name for some hours. The disorientation faded over the course of the day, but a degree of memory loss persisted. Fragments of recent days, sometimes longer periods, vanished from her memory and did not return. The memory loss was, in the medical view of the time, an acceptable side effect. A typical course of treatment was somewhere between 6 and 12 sessions, given 2 or 3 times a week. Some patients received many more. There were patients who received over 100 treatments over the course of years. After 1952, things improved. A muscle relaxant called succinylcholine was added to the procedure, which prevented the violent physical convulsion while still allowing the brain's electrical seizure to occur. This dramatically reduced the rate of fractures and other injuries. Shortly afterwards, short-acting anesthetics were added, so that the patient was unconscious for the procedure itself. By the late 1950s, modified electroconvulsive therapy, with anesthesia, muscle relaxant, and oxygen, had largely replaced the older unmodified form in most American hospitals. But not in all hospitals, and not for all patients. Some state hospitals, particularly those that were underfunded or understaffed, continued to perform unmodified treatments well into the 1960s. In some institutions, the older method persisted, in pockets, into the 1970s. The patients who received unmodified treatments in this later period were disproportionately poor, disproportionately black, disproportionately Hispanic, disproportionately committed involuntarily, disproportionately women. This is the technology you're about to encounter in 1962 if your stay in the women's ward extends beyond a few weeks of observation. This is the door at the end of the corridor. But before we walk through it, there is another door we need to look at first, because the other major treatment of the era, the one that has become, in retrospect, the most notorious, was not electroconvulsive therapy. It was the lobotomy, and the lobotomy in America had a face, and a name, and a van. We need to talk about Walter Freeman. Walter Jackson Freeman II was born in 1895 in Philadelphia into a family of doctors. His grandfather was a famous surgeon. His father was a respected physician. He grew up in a house where medicine was discussed at the dinner table, where medical textbooks were the casual reading material on the side tables, where the question of what he would do with his life was answered before he was old enough to ask it. He went to Yale. He went to medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. He completed his neurological training in the 1920s. By the 1930s, he was a respected, ambitious, energetic neurologist working in Washington, D.C. He was not, by training, a surgeon. This is important. He had never done surgical residency. He had no operating room privileges in the traditional sense. He worked in neurology, which in the 1930s was a discipline of diagnosis and observation rather than intervention. He examined patients, took histories, ordered tests, and prescribed what limited medications were available. The patients he saw, especially the institutionalized patients, were largely beyond his ability to help. He watched them deteriorate. He watched them spend years in state hospitals, sometimes decades, with no improvement. He found this professionally and personally frustrating. In 1935, he attended a neurology conference in London. At the conference, a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz presented his work on what he called prefrontal leucotomy, a surgical procedure in which a small instrument was inserted into the front lobes of the brain through holes drilled in the skull, and used to sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. Moniz had performed the procedure on 20 patients with severe psychiatric symptoms. He reported that the procedure had calmed them. Some, he said, had returned to something resembling normal life. Freeman was electrified. Here at last was an intervention. Here was something a doctor could do rather than something a doctor could merely watch. He returned to Washington determined to bring the procedure to American patients. He partnered with a neurosurgeon named James Watts, who was qualified to actually perform brain surgery, and together, in 1936, they performed the first lobotomy in the United States on a woman named Alice Hood Hammett. She was 63. She suffered from severe anxiety and depression. Her husband had brought her to Freeman in desperation. She did not want the surgery, but she was persuaded eventually that it would help. The surgery was performed in a Washington hospital. 2 holes were drilled in her skull, one on each side just above the temples. A specialized instrument called a leucotomy was inserted. The connections in the front of her brain were severed. The operation took several hours. Hammett survived. She returned home. According to Freeman's report, she was calmer afterwards. According to her husband, she was easier to live with. She lived another 5 years and died of pneumonia. This was the beginning. Over the next several years, Freeman and Watts performed lobotomies on hundreds of patients. They refined the technique. They published papers. They became, in their field, famous. The procedure was controversial from the beginning. Many psychiatrists objected to it on principle, and many neurosurgeons objected to it on technical grounds, but it spread. By the mid-1940s, lobotomies were being performed in psychiatric hospitals across the country. In 1949, Egas Moniz received the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his invention of the procedure. The prize gave the operation a stamp of international scientific legitimacy that it would carry for years. But Freeman was not satisfied with the traditional procedure. The traditional procedure required a neurosurgeon, an operating room drilling, general anesthesia, and a recovery period of days or weeks. Most state hospitals did not have neurosurgeons. Most state hospitals did not have proper operating rooms. The vast majority of institutionalized patients, in Freeman's view, would never get a lobotomy because the procedure was, in its current form, too expensive and too complicated to be done at scale. Freeman wanted to do it at scale. So he invented something else. He called it the transorbital lobotomy. It went around the surgical bottleneck entirely. Instead of drilling through the skull, the new procedure went in through the eye socket, specifically through the thin layer of bone at the top of the eye socket, just above the eyeball. The instrument used was originally a household ice pick taken from Freeman's own kitchen, although later it was replaced by a specially manufactured instrument called the orbitoclast that looked very much like an ice pick. The procedure was performed under electroconvulsive therapy as the anaesthetic. The patient was given a shock, rendered unconscious for several minutes, and during those minutes the procedure was performed. It went like this. The patient, unconscious from the shock, was laid on a table. The doctor lifted the upper eyelid. The orbitoclast was inserted between the eyeball and the upper eyelid, with the tip pressed against the thin bone at the top of the eye socket. The doctor tapped the back of the orbitoclast with a small hammer until the bone gave way. The instrument was then inserted into the brain to a calibrated depth, and swept from side to side in a specified motion designed to sever the connections in the prefrontal area. The instrument was withdrawn. The procedure was repeated on the other side. The whole thing took, in Freeman's hands, about 10 minutes. There was no operating room. There was no neurosurgeon. There was no general anesthesia. There were no stitches because the eye socket healed on its own. The patient woke up with 2 black eyes, sometimes with subconjunctival hemorrhages that made the whites of the eyes look bright red, and was usually able to walk with assistance within a few hours. Freeman performed this procedure thousands of times. The figure that historians cite most often is approximately 3,500, although the true number may be higher because his record-keeping became less careful over the years. He performed it on adults. He performed it on adolescents. He performed it on at least one child as young as 4 years old. He performed it on men. He performed it, in disproportionate numbers, on women. And then, in 1951, he began to travel. He bought a car. He had it customized. He turned it into a mobile lobotomy clinic. He called it, sometimes ironically and sometimes not, the Lobotomobile. He drove it across the United States, from state hospital to state hospital, demonstrating the transorbital procedure, training other doctors, and offering in many cases to perform the procedure himself on whatever patients the local staff wished to have treated. This is real. This happened. This is not a story. In the trunk of the car was his equipment: orbitoclasts, a portable ECT machine, batteries, hammers, gauze. He kept careful logs. He photographed his patients before and after. He sent the photographs back to his office in Washington. He performed on his road trips dozens of procedures a day. He moved through state hospitals like a traveling salesman, except that what he was selling was a brain operation, and the people he was selling it to were, for the most part, not the patients. He was selling it to the hospital administrators, to the families, to the husbands of restless wives, the parents of difficult daughters, the relatives of women who had been institutionalized for years and showed no sign of getting better. The pitch was simple. The patient as she is now is a burden. The procedure will calm her. She will be easier. She will be quieter. She may not be exactly the person you remember, but she will be manageable, and it costs almost nothing, and it can be done in an afternoon. He performed transorbital lobotomies in his own office in Washington, in state hospital wards across the country, in motel rooms, in at least one private home. He sometimes performed them with members of the press observing. He sometimes performed them with both hands at once, working on 2 patients in parallel, in front of audiences of doctors who had come to learn the technique. He was, by his own account, proud of his speed. He was also, by the late 1950s, increasingly out of favour with the mainstream medical establishment. Newer treatments, the antipsychotic drug chlorpromazine, marketed as Thorazine, had appeared in 1954 and had revolutionised the treatment of severe mental illness, had made the lobotomy seem barbaric and crude even to many who had supported it. The medical journals began to criticise him. His old partner Watts had refused to perform the transorbital version of the procedure and had broken with him professionally years earlier. His own family was increasingly uncomfortable with his work. But Freeman kept going, he kept driving, he kept performing the procedure. He performed his last lobotomy in 1967 on a woman named Helen Mortensen who had been one of his repeat patients. She died from a brain hemorrhage during the surgery. Freeman lost his hospital privileges after her death. He stopped operating. He continued for years afterwards to drive across the country in his car, visiting his former patients, taking notes on how they had done, photographing them in their kitchens and back gardens, building a personal archive that he believed would one day vindicate his work. He died of cancer in 1972. Approximately 40% of his lobotomy patients were women. The actual percentage varies by source and by which subset of his patients you look at, but the female majority is consistent across the data. The reasons for this are complicated, but they include the same reasons that women received more electroconvulsive therapy. The diagnostic categories of the time were tilted against women. The symptoms of unhappiness in housewives were more readily medicalized. Women were more likely to be brought to a doctor by a husband than the reverse, and once they were in the system processed them. This is the second door at the end of the corridor. You have been standing in the corridor for a long time now. The fluorescent lights are humming. The nurse with the clipboard has passed you twice. Somewhere down the hall, a buzzer goes off briefly and stops. The radio is playing Patti Page again, or perhaps it has been playing the whole time. Let's go back to your bed and rest for a moment. You're not tonight going through either of those doors. You're simply here, in the ward, on your first day, learning the shape of the place. Let's talk about the diagnoses. In 1962, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 2nd edition, is in use across American psychiatry. It is the dominant reference text for what counts as mental illness and what each category of mental illness is called. It will be replaced in 1968 by the 2nd edition, which will revise some categories and add others. The 1962 manual, the 1st edition, is a small book. It is less than 150 pages. It does not look at first glance like a particularly powerful object. It is in fact an extraordinarily powerful object. Inside it are listed in clean clinical language the names of all the conditions for which a person can be diagnosed, hospitalized, medicated, electroshocked and operated upon. The categories are presented as scientific. They are in fact a mixture of genuine clinical observation, mid-century cultural assumption, Freudian theory, behaviorist theory, and the personal preferences of the small committee of psychiatrists who wrote the manual. The categories have changed dramatically over time and will continue to change dramatically. What is in the manual in 1962 is not what is in the manual in 1968, which is not what is in the manual in 1980, which is not what is in the manual today. Each generation of psychiatrists believes, with some justification, that they have improved on the previous generation, and each generation is, in retrospect, partly right and partly embarrassed. Several of the categories in the 1962 manual will, in time, be removed entirely. Some will be split into smaller, more precise categories. Some will be merged. Some will be quietly redefined in ways that do not draw attention to the change. Homosexuality, for example, is in the 1962 manual as a sociopathic personality disturbance. It will be removed from the manual in 1973 after sustained activism by gay rights groups and a vote of the American Psychiatric Association. The 1962 women on the ward, however, do not yet know that the manual will be rewritten. To them, the diagnoses they have been given are simply the facts of their condition. Let us look at a few of the diagnoses you might find on the cards above the beds in the women's ward. Involutional melancholia. This is a depression occurring in middle age, particularly in women around the time of menopause. It is, in the framework of the 1962 manual, a distinct disorder, separate from ordinary depression, with its own characteristics, agitated rather than slowed, often involving guilt or hypochondria, often resistant to treatment. The category will, in later editions of the manual, be removed, because subsequent research will find no evidence that menopausal depression is meaningfully different from depression at other ages. But in 1962, it is real, it is recognized, it is treatable. It is, in many cases, treatable with electroconvulsive therapy, which the textbooks of the period describe as particularly effective for it. Hysteria. The category persists, although the word is going slightly out of fashion among the more modern psychiatrists, who prefer conversion disorder or hysterical neurosis. The diagnosis is given for symptoms that appear physical, but have no detectable physical cause: paralyses, blindness, fainting, seizures, mutism, pain. It is given overwhelmingly to women. The theoretical framework underlying the diagnosis is, in 1962, partly Freudian. The idea that the symptom represents the conversion of an unconscious psychological conflict into a physical form. The treatment is psychotherapy in theory. In practice, in a state hospital, the treatment may also include electroconvulsive therapy, particularly if the symptoms are persistent. Anxiety neurosis, a general category for chronic anxiety not associated with a specific phobia. The diagnosis is given freely. The treatment is, in 1962, increasingly the new minor tranquilizers, Miltown, Librium, soon Valium. For more severe cases, electroconvulsive therapy is also used. Schizoid personality, a personality characterized by emotional coldness, withdrawal, eccentricity, lack of interest in others. The diagnosis is sometimes given to women who do not display the expected level of warmth or social engagement. The line between schizoid personality and simply being introverted is, in 1962, not always carefully drawn. Inadequate personality. This is a category that will not survive. It will be removed from later editions of the manual entirely, on the grounds that it is essentially a moral judgment rather than a clinical diagnosis. In 1962, however, it is real. The official definition describes a person who shows inadequate response to intellectual, emotional, social and physical demands. The person is, in other words, not coping well with life. They are not productive enough. They are not adjusted enough. They are not, in some sense that the manual does not quite define, enough. Women receive this diagnosis. So do men, sometimes. So do people whose only real problem is that they are poor, or grieving, or exhausted, or trapped in a life that does not fit them. Psychoneurotic depressive reaction. Depression understood as a reaction to a specific life event, a loss, a disappointment, a stressful change. The diagnosis is, in the framework of the period, milder than the more severe forms of depression. The treatment is generally psychotherapy and medication. Manic depressive reaction, what will later be called bipolar disorder. The diagnosis is, in 1962, given less often than depression alone, partly because the manic phase is harder for family members to recognize as illness, and harder for women to display openly in the constrained social roles of the period. The treatment, before the introduction of lithium in widespread clinical use, includes electroconvulsive therapy. Schizophrenic reaction, the general category for what will later be called schizophrenia, with various subtypes. The diagnosis is, in 1962, given more broadly than it will be later. Patients diagnosed with schizophrenia in this period include many who would, today, receive different diagnoses entirely. Patients with mood disorders, with personality disorders, with autism, with various neurological conditions, with what was simply the consequence of long institutionalization. And then there are the categories that do not appear in the manual at all, but that exist as informal shorthand among the staff. Housewife syndrome, which is what some doctors call the constellation of fatigue, sadness, and irritability they see in their female patients. Tired blood, which is a marketing term from a vitamin tonic but which leaks into clinical conversation. Nerves, which is a word that does a great deal of work in mid-century medicine, describing everything from mild anxiety to severe psychosis depending on who is using it and to whom. The women in the beds in the ward have between them almost all of these labels. Some have 2 or 3 at once. The labels have been written into their charts, sometimes by Dr. Hendricks back home, sometimes by the admitting psychiatrist at this hospital, sometimes by an attending who has spent perhaps 15 minutes with them. The labels will determine what happens to them next. The labels will determine the medications they receive, the wards they are housed on, the therapies they are offered or required to undergo, the length of their stays, the conditions of their discharges. The labels are, in this sense, not really descriptions. They are doors. Each label opens onto a particular hallway in the building of mid-century psychiatry, and each hallway leads to particular rooms. Some of those rooms are the rooms with the chairs and the magazines, where a woman might sit twice a week and talk to a kindly listener about her life. Some of those rooms are the rooms with the pill cups, where she might be given a steady daily medication that takes the edges off her days. Some of those rooms are the rooms with the leather straps and the rubber bite blocks, and one of those rooms, in 1962, in some hospitals, still contains an ice pick on a tray and a man who is willing to use it. Which room a woman ends up in is determined by which label is written on the card above her bed, and which label is written on the card above her bed is determined by which doctor saw her first, and what mood he was in, and whether he had read the same article in the same journal that morning, and what he believed in his deepest unspoken self that women were for. It is hard to overstate how thin the partitions are between these rooms. How easily a woman who has come in with a diagnosis of anxiety neurosis might, after a difficult month, be re-diagnosed as having agitated depression, and from there be considered a candidate for ECT. How easily a woman whose ECT does not seem to be helping might be reconsidered as having something more fundamental wrong with her, something that calls for a more decisive intervention. How easily, in some institutions in some years, with some doctors, that intervention had been the lobotomy. The labels are doors. The doors are connected. The woman is at the centre of a building she did not design, holding a key that was made by someone else. Let us spend some time on her day. It is 6:30 in the morning. The lights in the women's ward come on all at once, with the soft mechanical thunk of a master switch being thrown. There is no warning. There is no gradual brightening. There is simply darkness, and then there is fluorescent light. The women blink. Some of them sit up immediately by long habit. Some of them lie still, eyes open, looking at the ceiling. The ceiling has a small water stain in the shape of a dolphin, in the third bed on the left. The woman in the third bed on the left has been looking at the dolphin for 6 weeks. A nurse moves through the ward. She's one of the day nurses taking over from the night nurse who is finishing her shift. The day nurse is Mrs. Larkin. She has worked at this hospital for 19 years. She has 3 children, the youngest of whom is now in high school. She is calm, efficient, kind in a businesslike way, and possessed of an extraordinary capacity not to see what she does not wish to see. She has, in her 19 years, watched many things that she has not entirely processed. She gets through her days by focusing on the immediate task in front of her, which is generally something practical: a bed to be made, a pill to be administered, a chart to be updated, a patient to be helped to the bathroom. She moves down the row of beds saying good morning, dear, to each woman in turn. The phrase is identical for every patient. It is delivered with a small efficient warmth, like a stamp. Some of the women answer, some do not. The women get up. They go to the long bathroom at the end of the ward where there are 5 toilets in stalls with doors that lock, and a row of sinks, and a single bathtub with a curtain around it. They use the toilets. They wash their faces. They brush their teeth with the small toothbrushes provided by the hospital. They look at themselves in the mirror above the sinks, which is large and slightly clouded with age, and which reflects them back at themselves in a slightly softened version, as if seen through a thin scrim of fog. Some of them like this mirror, because it makes them look younger. Some of them dislike it, because it makes everything look slightly unreal. They return to their beds. They dress. The clothes available to them are hospital-issued, simple cotton dresses in pale blue or pale green, plus a knitted cardigan if it is cool, plus soft slippers. Patients who have been at the hospital for a long time, and who have privileges, may wear their own clothes brought from home. The newer patients wear the standard issue. The cardigans are pilled. The dresses have been washed too many times. Everything smells faintly of bleach and of the industrial detergent the hospital laundry uses. By 7:15 breakfast. The dining room is downstairs, on the ground floor of the women's wing. It is a large room with long wooden tables, benches rather than chairs, and tall windows that face the lawn. The food is served cafeteria style, on metal trays, by women in white aprons who work in the hospital kitchen, and who, despite seeing the same patients every day, do not generally make eye contact with them. The trays are picked up at the end of a counter. Each tray contains the breakfast for the day. Today the breakfast is oatmeal, which is slightly grey, and a slice of buttered toast, which is slightly cold, and a cup of weak coffee, which has been brewed in an urn that was last properly cleaned in 1958, and a small dish of stewed prunes, which exist on the tray of every patient regardless of whether the patient has expressed any opinion about prunes. The women sit at the tables, they eat. The conversation is muted. Some women eat quickly, hungrily. Some women push the food around their plates. Some women feed each other, gently, where one woman has trouble managing utensils. A nurse stands at the door, watching. The watching is not aggressive. It is more like the watching of a teacher at a school cafeteria, with the difference that the teacher is also empowered to make notes in a chart. After breakfast, medications. This is the central ritual of the day. The women line up at a small Dutch door at the end of the dining room, behind which stands a nurse with a tray of small paper cups. Each cup contains the medications for one patient sorted by name. The patient steps to the door, says her name, takes the cup, swallows the pills with a sip of water provided in a second small cup, opens her mouth to show the nurse that the pills have indeed been swallowed, and steps aside. The next patient comes forward. The medications vary. Some patients are on chlorpromazine, the relatively new antipsychotic, which causes a particular slow shuffling gait that has become so recognizable in psychiatric patients that some doctors call it the Thorazine shuffle. Some patients are on Miltown or Librium. Some are on barbiturates, particularly phenobarbital, which is still in use despite increasing concerns about its safety. Some are on the early antidepressants, imipramine, which became available in the late 1950s, or one of the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which have a longer list of dangerous food interactions that the staff are not always vigilant about. Some are on insulin, although insulin coma therapy is by 1962 falling out of fashion. Some are on lithium, although lithium is not yet widely used in American hospitals and will not be for another several years. Most of them are on something. The drug-free patient is a rarity in the ward. The medications are taken. The line moves through the door. The whole process takes about 20 minutes for the ward of 40 women. By the end, a faint chemical heaviness has begun to settle over the room, not in any one person particularly, but in the collective atmosphere, as the various sedatives and antipsychotics and tranquilizers begin their work on 40 central nervous systems at once. The morning, after medications, is given over to various forms of activity. There is a craft room where the women may do simple craft projects, knitting, basket weaving, painting on pre-printed boards. There is a music room where a piano sits and a few of the women play. There is a small library. There is occupational therapy, in which the women are taught what are euphemistically called useful skills: sewing, basic cooking, cleaning. The skills are presented as therapeutic, although they are also, not coincidentally, the skills that the women will be expected to deploy when they return to their homes. There is also, for some patients, group therapy. This is a relatively new innovation in 1962, and the practice varies widely by hospital and by doctor. In some hospitals, group therapy means 12 women sitting in a circle with a psychiatrist, discussing their feelings. In other hospitals, group therapy means 12 women sitting in a circle with a psychiatrist, while the psychiatrist gives a brief lecture and then asks them to discuss whether they agree. In a few hospitals, it means 12 women sitting in a circle with a psychiatrist who has very specific theories about why each of them is here and is determined to persuade them of those theories. The quality of the experience depends, as it does in almost every aspect of mid-century psychiatry, entirely on which doctor the patient happens to draw. There is also, for the patients who are well enough or trusted enough, the privilege of walking outside. The grounds are large, there are paths through the lawns, there are benches under the trees, there is a small pond where in summer there are ducks. The patients who walk outside do so under supervision. They walk slowly in small groups or in pairs, or alone with a nurse at a distance. The fresh air is considered therapeutic. The view of the brick wall is considered by some patients the most beautiful view in the world, although what they are seeing when they look at it is not the wall itself, but the imagined other side of it. Lunch is at noon. It is similar to breakfast in form and quality. Sandwiches, soup, a small portion of fruit, water. The afternoon, again, is given over to activities, plus visiting hours on certain days for patients whose families come. The families come less often than the patients hope. There are reasons for this. The hospital is far from many of the women's homes. Visiting is emotionally difficult. The husbands have work. The children are in school. The siblings have their own families. The mothers, if they are still alive, are often elderly and unable to travel. Many of the women receive a visit once a month, or once every 2 months, or once every 6 months, or not at all. The card above the bed of the woman in the third bed on the left has been there for 14 months, and her husband has visited once. Dinner is at 5:30. Lights out is at 9. Between dinner and lights out there is a common room with a television, which plays whatever the night nurse on duty has selected. The television is small, and the picture is grainy. The patients sit in a semicircle around it and watch, mostly comedies. Comedies are easier than dramas. There is less to think about. This is the rhythm. This is the shape of the days. The days are calm except when they are not. When they are not, it is usually because someone has had an episode, a fight with another patient, a refusal of medication, an attempt to leave, an attempt to harm herself. These episodes are handled generally by the orderlies, who are large men with quiet voices, and by the nurses, who carry small needles in the pockets of their uniforms. The patient is calmed. The patient is sometimes restrained. The patient is sometimes moved to a different ward, one with fewer patients and more locks, where she will spend some days before being assessed and returned, or kept, depending on the assessment. And on certain mornings, 2 or 3 times a week, certain patients are taken downstairs early. They are taken before breakfast. They are taken in a small group, in a quiet procession, by a nurse with a clipboard. They are taken to a part of the building that the other patients rarely see. They are taken to the treatment room. We need to talk now about the treatment room. We have been circling it for a long time. Let us walk to its door and stand there and look at it and see what it actually is. The treatment room is in the basement of the central administrative building. There are several reasons for this. The basement is quieter than the upper floors. The basement is also, importantly, less visible to visitors, to journalists, to the occasional inspector from the State Department of Mental Health. The procedures performed in the treatment room are not, in 1962, secret. They are listed in the patient's charts. They are discussed at staff meetings. They are reported in aggregate statistics to the hospital board, but they are also not, in the architectural philosophy of the building, displayed. The treatment room is reached by a narrow stairway, then a corridor that no patient is taken down without a specific reason. Then a heavy door with a small reinforced window, then a second smaller door inside that one. Behind the second door, the room is not large. It is perhaps 15 feet by 20. The walls are tiled, white, with a band of pale green at waist height. The floor is concrete, painted grey, with a drain in the centre. The ceiling has bright fluorescent lights, 4 of them in 2 banks. The lighting is, by design, very strong. The technicians need to see what they're doing. There is one window, high up on one wall, but it has been painted over so that no light from outside enters, and no figure inside the room can be seen from outside. The painting was done in 1956, after a passerby on the lawn reported having seen, through the basement window, something he did not understand. The hospital administration decided to paint the window. The window has not been seen through since. In the centre of the room, slightly off-centre toward the back wall, is a padded table. The table is a hospital examination table, modified slightly. It is covered with a thin layer of waterproof material, beige in colour, that has been replaced 3 times in the last decade. It has restraints, leather straps with buckles, at the wrist positions, the ankle positions, and across the chest. The restraints have padded inner surfaces. They are designed to hold without bruising, although bruising does sometimes happen. Next to the table is the machine. The machine, in 1962, is a Reiter electrostimulator, manufactured by a small medical device company in Chicago. It sits on a wheeled metal cart at a height comfortable for the technician. It has a dark grey case, about the size of a small radio, with various dials and switches on its front panel. The dials control the voltage, the duration of the current, and the type of waveform delivered. The settings are recorded for each patient in a separate logbook, which is kept in a drawer underneath the machine. The patient's chart from upstairs is not always in the room during the procedure. The settings recorded in the logbook are usually, but not always, consistent with the orders written in the chart. From the machine, two thick rubber-coated wires emerge. They terminate in small flat metal pads, each about the size of a silver dollar, mounted on a flexible band that can be fitted around the patient's head. The pads will be moistened with saline solution before they are applied. The technician keeps a small jar of saline on the cart next to the machine, with a piece of gauze in it. Next to the table on the other side from the machine is a small steel cart. On the cart, on a tray, are the items needed for the procedure. A box of rubber bite blocks individually wrapped, intended to be used once and discarded. A box of disposable rubber gloves, in 2 sizes. A small selection of needles and syringes. Several glass vials containing the anesthetic medications used in the modified procedure. At this hospital, in this period, mostly methotrexate or thiopental, the short-acting barbiturate anesthetics. Also a vial of succinylcholine, the muscle relaxant. Also a small bottle of atropine, which is given before the procedure to dry secretions and protect the heart from the vagal response to the seizure. Also a stethoscope. Also a sphygmomanometer for measuring blood pressure. Also a small oxygen tank with a mask in case respiratory support is needed during recovery. This is the modified equipment, the equipment of the new safer procedure. This hospital, by 1962, performs modified ECT for most of its patients. The procedure has been considerably reformed since the early days. The patient is anaesthetized. The muscles are relaxed. The convulsion is brief and small, visible only as a fluttering of the face and a slight twitching of the toes. The chance of fracture is essentially eliminated. The procedure, in modified form, is safer than many surgical procedures of the same era. By the medical standards of 1962, it is a clean, modern, defensible treatment. This is true. It is also true that the hospital, until very recently, performed unmodified ECT. The cart in the corner of the room holds equipment that is no longer in use, but has not yet been thrown away. Older bite blocks, older restraints, an older logbook. In 1958, 4 years ago, this same room performed unmodified procedures every day. The patients were not anaesthetized. The convulsions were full and violent. The orderlies stood at the corners of the table and held the patients down. Some patients required additional treatments for fractures they sustained during the procedure. The room has been modernized, but the room remembers. This is also true. Down the hallway, behind a door that is now generally locked, is another small room. In this room there used to be a different kind of equipment. There used to be a small steel tray, and on the tray there used to be 2 slender steel instruments shaped roughly like ice picks, and a small hammer with a wooden handle. The room is no longer in use. The equipment has been put away in a closet somewhere. The hospital has not performed a lobotomy in 8 years. The last patient on whom one was performed at this hospital, in 1954, was a 31-year-old woman named Margaret, who had been admitted for what was diagnosed at the time as severe agitated depression following the death of her infant son. She's still a patient at the hospital. She lives in a different ward now, the ward for what the staff refer to as chronic care. She does not speak much. She likes the colour yellow. She has a small stuffed rabbit that she carries with her at all times. Her husband visits twice a year. The treatment room remembers. The closet down the hall remembers. The building remembers. You are not tonight going into the treatment room. You will not tonight go through the door. We are simply standing outside it, in the corridor, looking at the door and thinking about what is on the other side of it, and what was on the other side of it in years past, and what the women who pass through it carry with them now. Let us go back upstairs. There is a woman in the 3rd bed on the right whose name is Eleanor. Eleanor is 41 years old. She was admitted to the hospital in March of 1962. It is now November. She has been here for 8 months. Her chart, which sits in a manila folder at the nurses' station, contains a fairly detailed account of how she came to be here. The account is written in the voices of various doctors and social workers and family members, and is, like all such accounts, partly accurate and partly not. The parts that are accurate include the dates, the names, the medications. The parts that are not accurate include almost everything else. Eleanor grew up in a small town in Iowa. Her father was a high school teacher. Her mother kept the house. She had 2 younger brothers. She was, by all accounts, a bright, cheerful child, an excellent student, a girl who loved books and wrote little poems in a notebook she kept under her mattress. She wanted to be a writer when she grew up. She told her mother this once when she was 12. Her mother smiled and said that it would be lovely to write poems for the church newsletter someday. Eleanor went to the local state college. She studied English literature. She wrote for the college newspaper. She graduated in 1942. She had a degree, and she had ambitions, and she had a fiancé named Howard, who was in the Army Air Corps, and she had, more than anything, the absolute certainty that her life was about to begin. Howard came home in 1945. They married in 1946. They moved to a small house in a Chicago suburb. Howard took a job at an insurance company. Eleanor took a job at a small magazine, writing copy and occasionally placing little articles of her own. She loved the job. She loved the office. She loved the way her name appeared, occasionally in small print at the end of a paragraph. In 1948, she got pregnant. She kept working until she could no longer hide it, which was the convention of the period, and then she stopped. Her son was born in November of 1948. She did not return to work. The magazine sent flowers and a kind note. Howard's mother explained, gently and at some length, that of course she would not return to work, that it would be unseemly, that her place now was at home with the baby. Eleanor agreed. She did agree. She was tired, and the baby was beautiful, and the house needed her, and the magazine, after all, would survive without her. In 1951, a daughter was born. In 1953, another son. In 1956, another daughter. By 1956, Eleanor had 4 children under the age of 8, a husband who worked long hours, a house in a suburb with no one nearby who she could really talk to, and a notebook of poems under her mattress that she had not opened in 5 years. She did not, she would later tell the social worker, exactly notice the moment she stopped being herself. It was more like a slow draining away. By 1958, she was tired all the time, in a way that did not improve with sleep. By 1959, she had begun to cry without warning, at odd moments, in the kitchen, in the car, at the supermarket. By 1960, she was not sleeping well. By 1961, she had stopped being able to remember what she had been doing 5 minutes ago, which made the housework very difficult, which made everything more difficult, which made the crying worse. She went to her family doctor, Dr. Phillips, in March of 1961. He prescribed Miltown. The Miltown helped for a few months and then did not. He increased the dose. The increased dose helped for a few weeks and then did not. He prescribed Librium instead. The Librium helped a little, then it stopped helping. In November of 1961, Eleanor was found by her husband sitting in the bathtub with the water running over the edge. She was fully clothed. The bath had overflowed and was running down the hallway. She did not, when he asked her what she was doing, have an answer for him. She did not know how long she'd been there. She did not know what she had intended to do. She simply looked at him with an expression he had not seen before and said, very quietly, "I don't know." He called Dr. Phillips. Dr. Phillips referred her to a psychiatrist, Dr. Mercer. Dr. Mercer interviewed Eleanor for about an hour. He concluded that she was suffering from agitated depression with possible psychotic features. He recommended hospitalization. He recommended a course of electroconvulsive therapy. He told Howard that the procedure was modern, safe, well established, and very effective for cases like Eleanor's. Howard signed the papers. Eleanor signed the papers. Eleanor signed them because Howard said it would help, and because Dr. Mercer said it would help, and because Eleanor herself did not know what else to do. She was admitted to the hospital in March of 1962. She has had since then 2 courses of ECT. The first course was 12 treatments, given 3 times a week over 4 weeks. The second course, given when the first course did not produce a lasting improvement, was 18 treatments. She has had 30 treatments in total. The hospital considers this a relatively long course, but not an extraordinary one. Some patients have had 100 or more. The treatments have affected her in ways that are documented in her chart and in ways that are not. The documented effects include a general improvement in her mood, an increased ability to function in basic ways, a reduction in crying spells, and a noted retrograde amnesia covering the period of approximately 6 months before her first treatment. The amnesia, in the words of the chart, has partially resolved. This is a common phrase. It does not mean what it sounds like it means. It does not mean that the memories have come back. It means that Eleanor has stopped asking about them. The undocumented effects include the following. She cannot remember her wedding. She cannot remember the births of her 2 younger children. She cannot remember her mother's funeral, which was in 1959, although she remembers her mother. She cannot remember the names of 2 of her closest friends from college. She cannot remember any of the poems she wrote in her notebook, which Howard, going through her things while she was in the hospital, found and read for the first time, and which made him cry in a way he did not entirely understand. She also has lost something else. It is hard to describe. It is not memory exactly, or not only memory. It is more like a flatness in the centre of her experience. The world is still there. She can see it. She can interact with it. But the way she used to feel things, the slight catch in her chest when she heard a particular kind of music, the quick rising bubble of pleasure when she saw a particular kind of light through a window, the small private flickers of recognition that she used to have when a sentence in a book said something true, these have been turned down or moved away or muffled. She's not sure whether they will come back. She's not sure whether they were ever as bright as she remembers, because her memory is now an unreliable instrument. She is, by the criteria of the hospital, improving. She is eating, she is sleeping, she is participating in occupational therapy. She has not cried in 3 weeks. The doctors are pleased. She's being prepared for discharge. The discharge plan, which is in her chart, calls for her to be released to her husband's care in mid-December. She will return home. She will continue to take her medications, Librium and a newer antidepressant called amitriptyline. She will see Dr. Mercer once a week for supportive psychotherapy. She will, in time, resume her duties as a wife and mother. She will, the chart predicts, do reasonably well. This is the official story. It is in its own way a success. There is also another story, which is not in the chart, which Eleanor has not told anyone, and which she is not entirely sure she could put into words even if she wanted to. The other story is about who she was. It is about the notebook under the mattress. It is about the small print at the end of a paragraph in a magazine in 1947. It is about whether the woman who is being discharged in December is the same woman who was admitted in March, or whether she's a different woman wearing the first woman's face. It is about whether the difference matters, given that the first woman was, by every official account, ill. Eleanor does not know the answer to these questions. She's not sure anyone does. She's sitting now at 5 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in November, in the common room of the women's ward. She's reading a book. The book is a paperback novel, a mystery, picked up from the small library down the hall. The book is fine. She's enjoying it, in a quiet way. Outside the window, the sun is setting. The light on the lawn is the particular long gold light of November afternoons in the Midwest. The light that touches the bare branches of the trees and turns them briefly into something more elaborate than they are. Eleanor watches the light. She finds it, she thinks, beautiful. Then she returns to her book. The mystery in the book is about to be solved. Eleanor turns the page. She is, by every standard the hospital uses, getting better. Let us widen the lens. Across the United States, in 1962, there are approximately 500,000 people in psychiatric hospitals at any given time. The exact number varies by year and by how one counts, but the figure is roughly stable. The population of state and county psychiatric hospitals reached a peak in 1955 at about 558,000 patients. It has been declining slightly since, partly because of the introduction of chlorpromazine and other antipsychotic medications that allow some patients to be managed outside the hospital, and partly because of an emerging policy idea called deinstitutionalization that will, over the next 30 years, dramatically transform American psychiatric care, generally in ways that will turn out to be more complicated than their architects anticipated. But in 1962, the great wave of deinstitutionalization has not yet begun in earnest. The state hospitals are still full. There are women like Eleanor in dozens of states. There are wards like the one she lives in hospitals like the one she is in, all over the country. The total number of women receiving ECT in American psychiatric facilities in 1962 is somewhere in the range of 100,000 per year, by various estimates, though good national data is difficult to find for this period. The total number of women who have received it at some point in their lives, by 1962, is in the hundreds of thousands. The total number who have received lobotomies, on the other hand, has plateaued. By 1962, the procedure has largely fallen out of fashion in the mainstream medical community, although as we have seen, Freeman is still performing them, and so are a small number of other practitioners. The cumulative total of lobotomies performed in the United States by 1962 is somewhere around 40,000 to 50,000, depending on the source. Approximately 60% of those patients were women. The procedure has been performed at scale primarily between about 1945 and 1955. The patients who received it during that decade are now, in 1962, in their 40s and 50s and 60s. They are scattered. Some are in institutions, some are at home, some have died. The ones who are alive are generally not asked very often about how they are doing. There are also, by 1962, women like Eleanor who have not yet been hospitalized but who are heading in that direction. There are women on Miltown and Librium in numbers that exceed any psychiatric medication ever previously prescribed. By 1965, Librium will be the best-selling drug in the United States. By the late 1960s, Valium will overtake it. The Rolling Stones will write a song about it, calling it Mother's Little Helper. The song will become a hit. The cultural moment will eventually fade. But by 1962, the foundation of that moment is already in place. The women who will, in 5 years, be taking small yellow pills by the millions are already taking them by the millions. The question of why this happened, why it happened to women in particular, why it happened in such numbers, why it happened in this specific period, is one that historians and sociologists and feminist scholars and medical ethicists have been working on ever since. The answers are partial and they intersect. One part of the answer is that the post-war American household was, for many women, a kind of slow-motion crisis. The expansion of the suburbs, the increasing isolation of housewives from extended family and from other women, the cultural insistence on domestic perfection as the measure of female worth, the reduction of women's social roles to a very narrow set of permitted activities, all of these produced, predictably, large numbers of unhappy women. The unhappiness was real. It was not imagined. It was not, in most cases, the product of mental illness in any meaningful clinical sense. It was the product of lives that did not fit. Another part of the answer is that the medical and psychiatric professions of the period were almost entirely male. The doctors who saw these unhappy women were men. The psychiatrists who diagnosed them were men. The hospital administrators were men. The pharmaceutical company executives who marketed the new tranquilizers were men. The advertisements they approved, showing the troubled housewife who would benefit from a small daily pill, were designed by men, written by men, and aimed at the prescribing decisions of other men. The entire pipeline from kitchen to hospital was male-staffed at every important node. This does not mean that the men involved were malicious. Most of them were not. Most of them, like Dr. Hendricks, were doing what they had been trained to do, what their textbooks told them was correct, what their colleagues approved of. They were treating a clinical condition with the tools available to them. The fact that the clinical condition was, in many cases, a cultural problem dressed in medical language was not something they were trained to see. The fact that the tools available to them were sometimes worse than the condition was not, generally, something they were eager to acknowledge. A third part of the answer is institutional momentum. Once the state hospitals existed, they needed patients. Once the new drugs existed, they needed to be prescribed. Once the doctors had been trained in particular techniques, they needed cases on which to practice them. The system, having been built for a particular purpose, became, in some ways, its own customer. Patients flowed into the system because there was a system for them to flow into. Treatments were given because there were treatments to give. The system did not, on the whole, ask hard questions about whether it was helping, because hard questions about whether the system was helping would have been hard questions about whether the system should exist, and very few of the people inside the system were positioned to ask those questions. A fourth part of the answer is that the women themselves often did not have the language to refuse. They had been raised, almost all of them, in a culture that taught women to defer to medical authority. Doctors knew best. Doctors had years of training. Doctors were trying to help. A woman who refused her doctor's recommended treatment was, in the framework of the period, either being unreasonable or making her condition worse through her own resistance. A woman who refused repeatedly in a hospital setting could be recategorized as uncooperative or resistant, which were themselves notes that could appear in a chart and could influence subsequent treatment decisions. The system rewarded compliance and punished refusal, often in ways that were not made explicit but were nonetheless real. A fifth part of the answer is that the broader culture, including women's own families and friends, generally supported the treatment recommendations. A husband whose wife had been hospitalized did not, on the whole, second-guess the doctor. A mother whose daughter was struggling did not generally seek a second opinion. The recommendations of the psychiatric establishment had a kind of moral weight that came from a long history of authority. To question them, in 1962, was to question the structure of legitimate medical knowledge itself, and most people, then as now, were not inclined to do that. All of this, taken together, produced the situation in the women's ward in 1962. It produced Eleanor. It produced the woman in the third bed on the left, who has been looking at the dolphin-shaped water stain for 6 weeks. It produced the women in the chronic care ward, including Margaret, who carries her stuffed rabbit. It produced the women in the kitchens with the smiling teapot clocks, taking their small daily doses of Milltown, who would, some of them, end up in the wards eventually, and some of whom would not. It produced also the long shadow that lies over the story we're telling, because the women's ward in 1962 is, in retrospect, only one chapter. There were other chapters before, there will be other chapters after. Let us for a moment look at the chapters after, not in detail, just in outline, so that we know where this story is going. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy will sign the Community Mental Health Act. The Act will provide federal funding for community-based mental health centers on the theory that many psychiatric patients can be better treated outside of large institutions. The Act will, over time, accelerate the deinstitutionalization movement. State hospitals will begin to close, patient populations will begin to decline. By 1980, the state hospital population will be less than a third of what it was in 1955. By 2000, it will be less than a tenth. This sounds, at first, like good news. It is in many ways good news. The state hospitals were grim. The treatments they offered were often harmful. The mass institutionalization of mentally ill people, and of people who were not exactly mentally ill, but were inconvenient or unhappy, or simply female in the wrong way, was an enormous moral failure of the mid-20th century. Closing the hospitals was the right impulse. The execution was, however, very imperfect. The community mental health centers that were supposed to receive the deinstitutionalized patients were never adequately funded. The Vietnam War and the inflation of the 1970s redirected federal money elsewhere. State budgets were cut. Many of the patients who left the hospitals had nowhere to go. Some returned to families that could not care for them. Some ended up in nursing homes or rooming houses. Some ended up on the streets. The current homeless population of the United States, particularly the subset who are severely mentally ill, is, in a meaningful and traceable way, a direct downstream consequence of decisions that were made in the 1960s and 1970s about how to reform the psychiatric system. This is one of the chapters after. Another chapter is the slow reform of psychiatric practice itself. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the more egregious abuses were curtailed. Informed consent procedures were improved. The diagnostic manual was rewritten twice, with growing emphasis on observable criteria rather than theoretical interpretations. The category of homosexuality was removed. The category of inadequate personality was removed. Hysteria was reframed. The use of ECT decreased dramatically, then increased somewhat, then stabilized at a much lower level than its 1950s peak, with modern protocols that are dramatically safer than the old ones. The lobotomy disappeared as a routine procedure, although a small number of psychosurgeries continued to be performed for very specific and rare indications. The pharmaceutical revolution continued. The minor tranquilizers were eventually recognized to be addictive, which had been suspected for years but was minimized in the marketing. The market shifted to newer classes of antidepressants in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which had different problems but were not addictive in the same way. The cultural conversation about women's mental health slowly opened up. Betty Friedan published her book in 1963. The women's movement of the late 1960s and 1970s named the problem in ways it had not previously been named. The general assumption that female unhappiness was a medical condition began to weaken. It did not disappear. It is not gone now. In 2025, women are still prescribed psychiatric medications at rates that significantly exceed those of men. The reasons for this are complicated, and not all of them are the same as the reasons in 1962, and the medications themselves are different, and the diagnostic frameworks are different, and the doctors are different. Many of them are women now. But the basic pattern, the pattern of female distress being managed pharmaceutically as a primary intervention, persists. The chapter is not closed, it has merely been edited. This is the long shadow. We are telling the 1962 story tonight because it is, in many ways, the most extreme version of the pattern. The ECT machine in the basement, the orbitoclast in the closet, the diagnosis of inadequate personality, the lobotomy van. These are extreme. They are also, in important ways, continuous with what came before and what came after. They are the visible peak of a longer history of how unhappy women have been handled by medicine. The peak is more dramatic than the rest of the range, but the range is real. The mountains exist. We can see them clearly from here. We are, in this story, standing at a high point. The view extends backwards into the hysteria diagnoses of the 19th century, and the wandering womb theories of the ancient world, and the witch trials of the medieval period. The view extends forwards into the pharmaceutical landscape of the present, with its different but related problems. The view, from this peak, is wide. It is, however, getting late. Let us return to the ward. Let us return to Eleanor. It is night now in the women's ward. The fluorescent lights have been dimmed. The dimming is partial. The lights are not entirely off because the night nurse needs to be able to see, and because some patients are afraid of complete darkness. The light that remains is a low yellow glow that comes mostly from a single fixture above the nurse's desk at the end of the ward. The light falls in soft pools on the linoleum floor. The corridor outside the ward is also softly lit. The building, after dark, has a different quality than it has by day. It is quieter but not silent. It hums. The building always hums. It hums with the ventilation system, with the radiators, with the distant kitchen, with the various electrical devices in the various rooms, with the small noises of the night staff doing their rounds. The women are in their beds. Most of them are asleep. Some of them are not. The ones who are not sleeping are lying with their eyes open, looking at the ceiling, or turned toward the wall, or with their faces pressed gently into their pillows. The night nurse passes through the ward every 20 minutes. She walks softly. She wears soft-soled shoes for this purpose. She carries a small flashlight that she does not use unless she needs to. She does not need to tonight. Eleanor is in her bed. She is not asleep yet. She is on her back. The blanket is pulled up to her chest. Her hands are folded over the blanket. She is looking at the ceiling. The ceiling, above her bed, has a single hairline crack that runs from one corner toward the centre. The crack has been there for years, she has been told. It is part of the natural settling of an old building. It is not a sign of structural problems. It is simply a small line in the plaster, visible in the dim light, running diagonally for about 3 feet and then ending. Eleanor has been looking at the crack on and off for 8 months. She has memorized its exact shape. She has noticed the small irregularities along its length, the tiny widening near one end, the slight wobble in the middle, the way it tapers at the other end. She has thought at various points that the crack resembles various things: a river on a map, a vein, a pencil line drawn by a very slow hand, the path of an ant. None of these comparisons has ever felt exactly right. The crack is finally just a crack. It does not resemble anything but itself. This is the kind of thinking she does now. It is calmer than the thinking she used to do before. She remembers, vaguely, that she used to think differently, more elaborately, more anxiously, with more leaps and connections. She's not sure whether she misses the old thinking or whether she prefers the new. The question itself feels too large to answer. She lets it pass. Outside, beyond the window with the wire mesh, the November sky is very dark. There are stars faintly, but the lights of the building wash most of them out. The grounds are quiet. A small wind moves through the bare branches of the elms along the drive. Somewhere in the distance a freight train passes, on its way from somewhere to somewhere, and its horn sounds twice, long and low, and then fades into the night. Eleanor closes her eyes. In 2 weeks she will be discharged. She will go home to a house she has not seen in 8 months, to children who have been told that mother was sick and is getting better, to a husband who loves her in his quiet, careful way, to a kitchen she will need to relearn, to a life that has continued without her and will need to make room for her again. She does not know how this will go. She has stopped trying to predict it. The predicting was, the doctors told her, part of what had been making her anxious. So she has stopped predicting. She will simply, when the time comes, go home and see. The radiator in the corner clanks. The wind moves. Down the corridor, the night nurse turns a page in her book. Eleanor does not exactly fall asleep. She drifts. The drifting is partly the medications and partly the long flatness of her recent months, and partly simply the late hour. The room around her softens. The crack in the ceiling fades. The faces of the other women in the ward, dimly visible in the low light, become indistinct. The hum of the building grows steadier. She thinks, just before she lets go, of a moment from a long time ago. She's 23 years old. She's sitting at a desk at the small magazine office in Chicago. It is a Friday afternoon. The light through the office window is the same kind of long, gold light she saw this afternoon on the lawn. She's just placed a short article of her own, a small piece, only 3 paragraphs, about a new book, and the editor has read it and nodded and said good work and walked back to his own desk. She's alone at her desk looking at the typewriter, and the typewriter has her name on a small card taped to its side, and the name is hers, and the desk is hers, and the article is hers, and outside the window the city's going about its evening, and she has, for one bright, clean moment, the absolute certainty that her life is exactly the right size. She does not know, in the moment, that she will spend the next 20 years slowly losing track of it. She does not know about the suburb, or the children, or the bathtub, or the hospital, or the ECT machine. She does not know any of it. She is 23. She has placed an article. The light is gold. The memory is, in a strange way, intact. It is one of the few things that came through. She does not know whether it survived the treatments because it was unusually strong, or because it was unusually far back, or because some part of her, some deep part, refused to give it up no matter what was done to her. She does not know. She is grateful, in the dim way she is now grateful for things, that it is there. She drifts further. The ward grows quieter. The wind dies. The night nurse at her desk looks up briefly, scans the ward, sees nothing requiring attention, and returns to her book. Beyond the window the stars wheel slowly. The earth turns. The building hums. The hum is steady. The hum is what the building does. It will hum like this all night, and tomorrow, and the night after that. Eleanor sleeps. It is later still. The hospital is mostly silent now. The kitchen is dark. The administrative offices are locked. The treatment room in the basement is empty, its door closed, its window painted, its machine sitting quietly on its cart, its straps loose on the table, its room temperature gradually equalizing with the cool of the basement. The closet down the hall, with the orbitoclasts in their padded case, is also locked. The case has not been opened in 8 years. It will not be opened tomorrow. It will not be opened next year. It will, eventually, in the early 1970s, be quietly taken out and donated to a medical museum, where it will sit behind glass with a small explanatory plaque and be looked at by visitors who will find it hard to believe what they are reading. But that is in the future. Tonight, in 1962, the case is in the closet and the closet is dark. The corridors are dim. The wards are quiet. Most of the women are asleep. The few who are not are lying still, breathing softly in the long, slow rhythm of late night. Outside, the grounds are dark. The lawn is silver under the partial moon. The brick wall surrounding the property is a deeper darkness against the lighter dark of the sky. Beyond the wall, the small road that runs past the hospital is empty. There are no cars at this hour. The town beyond the road has gone to bed. In the town, in the houses, in the bedrooms, other women sleep. Some of them are taking the same medications that the women in the ward are taking. Some of them are not. Some of them are happy, or at least content, in the small private ways that are possible inside the lives they have. Some of them are not. Some of them, in the years to come, will end up in wards like this one, and some of them will not. There is no clean line that separates the two groups. The line is, in fact, mostly drawn at the moment a particular doctor on a particular day decides that a particular woman has crossed it, and the decision is, very often, made for reasons that have less to do with the woman herself than with the doctor. The day, the year, the diagnostic manual, the available treatments, the prevailing assumptions, the entire weight of the culture, as it presses down through the office of an ordinary practitioner onto an ordinary patient. This is, in the end, what this story's about. It is not really about ECT or lobotomies or Milltown or Walter Freeman or the hospital or the ward, or even Eleanor. It is about the way a society can take its own contradictions and project them onto the bodies and minds of its weaker members, and then, having created the suffering by its own choices, treat the suffering with the most aggressive tools available, and call the treatment medicine. The medicine is not exactly a lie. The doctors are not exactly lying. The system is not exactly a conspiracy. It is something stranger and harder to name. It is what happens when a culture builds a trap, and then, when the trapped person cries out, send someone in to fix the person. This is the brutal lie. Not a single lie told by a single doctor on a single day. A larger lie. A lie of category. A lie about what a woman is for, and what her unhappiness means, and what should be done about it. The smaller lies, that ECT is harmless, that lobotomies are gentle, that Milltown is not addictive, that the diagnoses are scientific, that the system is benign, are downstream of the larger one. The smaller lies could not have been believed without the larger one in place. It took a long time to begin to dismantle. It is not, even now, entirely dismantled. But tonight, in the ward, the women are asleep. Eleanor is asleep. Margaret, down in chronic care, is asleep with her stuffed rabbit on the pillow beside her. The woman in the third bed on the left, the one with the dolphin water stain, is asleep. Mrs. Larkin, the day nurse, is at home in her own bed, on the other side of town, asleep next to her husband. Dr. Mercer, who recommended Eleanor's ECT, is asleep in a large bed in a large house, with a wife and 3 children. Dr. Hendricks, the general practitioner, is asleep in a smaller bed in a smaller house with his wife. Walter Freeman, in his 60s now, is asleep somewhere. He's still alive, still occasionally driving his lobotomobile, still photographing his old patients in their kitchens, and he too is at rest tonight. The building hums, the radiators clank, the wind moves through the elms. The night nurse turns the last page of her book, marks her place, and looks up at the ward. The ward is still. She makes a small note in her log. She rises, very quietly, and walks the length of the dormitory one more time, checking that each woman is breathing. Each woman is breathing. She returns to her desk. She picks up another book. The clock above her desk reads 3:45. The earth turns, the stars wheel. The lights of the small town beyond the wall blink slowly off, one by one, as the latest sleepers finally surrender. Tomorrow the building will fill with light and sound again. The women will wake. The medications will be given out. The trays will come from the kitchen. The schedules will resume. In the basement, the treatment room will be opened, and the technicians will arrive, and a small number of women will be brought down in a quiet procession by a nurse with a clipboard. The day will repeat the day before. But that's tomorrow. Tonight, in the long hours before dawn, the hospital is quiet. The women are asleep. The crack in the ceiling above Eleanor's bed is invisible in the dim light. The window with the wire